Hello and welcome to another view from Mayor Brown. This sits alongside our regular podcast and is an occasional series of interviews with those involved in the changes going on in employment law. The podcast is presented by Nicholas Robertson, the head of Mayor Brown's London employment team. At the end of the podcast, we will explain how to get in touch if you have any comments or questions.
Hello and welcome to another view from Mayor Brown. I'm delighted to be joined once again by Liz Stern, who is head of our global mobility and migration practice. She's based in Washington, but truly she operates on a global basis, helping international employers with their global staffing matters. Liz, I'm delighted to welcome you once again to the podcast.
I am so honoured to be here.
I think you've done more repeat visits onto the podcast than anyone else, which probably is worthy of a trophy in its own right. So, but we're delighted to have you back again.
Thank you.
Now, what we're going to talk about is Brexit related in this podcast, because we did a seminar, a workshop for clients on Brexit and staffing matters affected by Brexit. But coming out of that, you and I were talking about a subject for a podcast around, imagine, if you will, an international employer. It's looking at a mobility programme. It's got staff, some who may be seconded, there may be business travel, there may be permanent postings, and you or I were going to talk about elements of the mobility programme. If you were acting for an international employer, what are the most important parts of the mobility programme, bearing in mind the Brexit arena in which we're operating? So if you were starting, what would you say was the starting point for an international employer in connection with its mobility programme? Things that it must get right if it's going to deal with the environment in which we're operating?
I think there are several elements. In a conference that we hosted for clients just recently, we talked about 5 must-have elements, all of which are designed to have the company know who it's sending where, have a decision-making process that they can count on for how they make those decisions, and that is audit-worthy, and then creating both a record and instilling a culture of how to do things that they can then rely on in the context of the substantial change that Brexit will pose, because they will be under the microscope as Brexit occurs for this mobility program that they have, and preparing now will help them obviously be ready later.
And there's 2 parts, I suppose, to that. One is Brexit and the impact on free movement, or potential impact on free movement. But we're also thinking about this from a global perspective, and the world, the way the world is going, where in America, for example, Make America Great Again, and so on. So there is a context for this that means that companies need to get their mobility programs right, or bad things will happen.
That's right. In this kind of environment where it really is a populist global movement is emerging that's actually incredibly protectionist and slightly fear-based. What will we do with all the influx of people that are coming into our country and changing our culture? And now the British are no longer British, et cetera, or the American base, the borders must be closed and a wall must be built. Whatever the rhetoric around it, in that context, companies that are unprepared will be stung. It's not only that people won't get in, but it's high enforcement for them. So instilling a culture and protocol is a good protection for the company. It's also a good opportunity for the leadership in the company over employment issues, whether that be legal, global mobility, HR, to gain some control and even some stature within the company, because they're administering a function that isn't just administrative anymore.
So actually, if you're looking for a silver lining, this quite challenging environment in which you are operating, you are providing advice to clients, there's an upside for those who are administering the mobility program, that these are issues that should be attracting the attention of the very senior management in an organisation.
Absolutely. This is the time.
Okay, so after that rousing call to arms, so where do we start? What would be your number one? Where would you start if you're looking at elements of a mobility program that a group, international company, needs to get right?
I think the first priority is to establish a reliable process and mandate for immigration decision making. companies often have immigration decisions coming from various sources. A business manager who needs to mobilize a team for deployment in a particular country on a particular customer project. Very legitimate reason for that, of course. An employee who says, I would really like to work somewhere else, or my partner's just moved there and I'd like to be able to go. And then 5 other employees say, that sounds awfully good. I'd love to work in Paris, so why not? Let me try that. Or even sometimes different constituents within the organization that really shouldn't be at the business staffing decision making, but are within a project and find that it might be convenient to bring some folks over. Okay. And this is the time to say, no, let's establish a protocol. Let's have a central resource that looks at how candidates are actually nominated for sponsorship. Let's determine what the reasons are that those people are being nominated. What are the standards for nomination? Does the person's performance have to be at a certain level? Does the business need to include a sign-off by a certain a VP level as opposed to simply a manager level, for example, et cetera, et cetera? What are the standards? And then what is the escalation process and final authorization process? That creates an awful lot of legitimacy, and it can do a very nice return on investment for the company as to who they're sending where. Plus it begins the transparency for tracking purposes because it goes to one point within the company.
I can see that. And I think it sounds like a sort of corporate governance structure
Exactly.
around this process, which I know we've said on previous podcasts, if people do not pay attention to who they're sending, where they're sending, why they're sending, they can get themselves all sorts of enforcement difficulties. They may not be applying for the right visas, they may be sending the wrong people. And they may also lose the experience and benefits of a seconding or posting, that the person then leaves the company or doesn't return to the company or returns to the company at the end of it and is dissatisfied, and all that investment and experience is lost.
Exactly.
And if you think about that up front, is this person going to stay with the company long term? If the success of the secondment, for example, is going to be measured in someone will come back to the company with extra experience that they will then give to the company, one of your metrics presumably is going to be, do we think this person is going to stay long term with the company?
Exactly. And things that fold into a strategy inevitably yield better results. Ironically, companies often have this thought through for normal recruitment, but not so much for mobile assignments or deployments.
Well, sometimes there is a sense of it and this is your area rather than mine, but there's a sort of must fill this gap.
Yes.
Put someone in gap, tick box, now where's my next challenge? And
Exactly.
I'll worry about what happens down the road. Is this possibly something you've seen in your...
It is.
Yeah. Okay, so setting up a corporate governance process, my terms, not yours, that an effective framework for decision making with the right people authorising it gives a degree of solidity in the decision making process. All right, so that's one. We said there'll be 5 things. What's 2 on your list?
2 is monitoring business travelers. This is a very difficult one because it isn't so. Mobility today is not simply about traditional expatriate assignments. It's about much more short-term, quick travel, movement in and out of countries, movement in and out of regions, and sometimes even multi-country assignments. And in that context, there are a lot of business travelers. And business travelers may often feel that they have the ability to judge themselves whether the purpose and the duration they're going in for is appropriate, because they personally are not thinking of it as a relocation. And that creates great danger because business travel is in the eyes of the enforcement authorities across locations that have this parochialism and security coming into it. So the worst that happens is the company just has no idea who's going where until after it's happened. The more common is there's some idea, but it's often after the fact, and the company's more likely to know about it because of people that have gotten too close to the tax trigger for creating a permanent establishment, for example. That trigger will not be enough to protect them if they are inspected by an aggressive authority.
Right.
So really creating new approaches that create a culture of knowing that business travel is not as easy as it used to be is critical. And then having tools. tools that tie into travel reimbursement, tools that tie into, yes, exactly. That's a very good way to start to catch who's gone where and why they're not notifying the company about it.
Yeah, I can see that. But is it something that people don't think of it as being akin to global mobility? I'm just flying in for a meeting, I'm flying in for a week's project or something. So the people who are doing it just don't see the danger, and so you need some sort of control, corporate governance again, over the top of it to make sure business travel, it truly is something that can be justified as business travel rather than disguised posting or secondment or whatever.
Exactly. You really need to do that. And what we find is that there are many, many people that still believe that if they are on the payroll of the home country company, that going into the host country, even if they're spending not a week, but 90, 100, 120 days,
right,
just isn't really a problem. Now, they may not fly over expecting to stay that long, but if it evolves into that during the course of their trip, they're not at all concerned about it because they're still payrolled back home. But what we are seeing is that the ports are themselves, the port officials are nervous about getting things wrong, and that the port officials will be sanctioned for saying yes when they shouldn't. They will never be sanctioned by the current type of regime that we're seeing around the world for saying no
when they should have said yes.
Absolutely. Okay. Think of the travel ban in the United States. They're not going to get sanctioned for that. So they are going to be more rigorous, and the business visitor who assumes that the old rules apply will be in trouble. Now, assume that Brexit happens, and what happens to those new EU travelers who, even though they're reading in the headlines about Brexit, still aren't thinking about that in the context of their travel.
Yes, I can see that. Okay, all right, so that's 2 out of our 5 things. What would you say was the next on your list of must-haves for a mobility program of this nature?
I think now an audit trail needs to be maintained.
You mentioned an audit trail in one of the earlier, as part of one of the earlier answers. I was going to come back and ask about that. So talk about the audit trail and why it's important.
The audit trail is now critical because it's virtually impossible for a company of a size to actually know everyone that's moving where. We've just talked about business travelers and having controls, having standards, having a system. But there simply are some people who will travel in the thick of the moment and the company won't know about it. And in that context, the company wants to be protected because it has an audit trail, that it has a process, that it looks for things, that when they find that there have been deviations from that process, that they have an approach to correct, troubleshoot, and remediate. This type of showing to an investigative authority to be made on the fly when the company is unprepared would be very, very difficult. But the difference between a company that says, these are our processes, this is how we attempted to meet them, this is what we do when we don't meet them, and this is my job, me, whoever is in charge of this particular function, to ensure that it's met, it's just a completely different reception from that investigative authority. That's not the company that they need to go after. That's a company that they can actually say, you're doing well, continue along this way.
The analogy, and I often bump into this in the employment stuff that I do, it's a world of difference between turning up in front of a tribunal saying, although we didn't actually address the problem at the time, this is what we would have said if we'd addressed the problem, and a company that says, here's the problem, we've addressed it ahead of time, but we're still making the decision to dismiss or whatever it is. And It's just chalk and cheese. A tribunal is much more like to go, well, they are a thoughtful, prepared company, they are doing the sort of things we'd expect them to do.
Yes.
And the other is, we're trying to rationalise a way that at the time we didn't do what we maybe should have done, but it doesn't matter because we had a good reason for not doing it.
Exactly right. And this approach of keeping the audit trail and having the record of all the good things that have been done, in addition to doing 1 and 2, right, establishing the decision framework and also having a system for business travelers, in conjunction with that actually meets the standards for a great compliance program that can mitigate adverse sentencing if you engaged in criminal activity, whether such as corruption, for example, if you were dealing with violations of, in the United States, the Foreign Corrupt, or outside of the United States, the Foreign Corrupt Services Act, or the Anti-Bribery Act in the United Kingdom, for example, authorities have actually written down that companies that are prepared in advance and do this and can show that they've done it are going to be treated with greater leniency than others.
Interesting. And is it something that if you have this, if you have no audit trail, if complaints come up, like whistleblowing, for example,
yes.
that you may end up finding it's much more difficult to prove that the fundamental whistleblowing complaint is unjustified?
Yes. Because
you haven't got the tools at your trade to push back.
Right. That's the point where the circumstantial data
yes.
will look very convincing, because you've got nothing to show that actually there was a good faith approach and the whistleblower has misinterpreted it.
So is part of what you're suggesting is necessary as part of the mobility program that you need to be very careful about tracking and monitoring? Is that one of the essential parts of this?
Well, indeed. That is the fourth of the fifth. You have to have a line of sight to who's going where and be able to keep an eye on things. You can't really address how to control the program if you don't know what's happening. And the best way to do that is to centralize tracking and monitoring in one source, but with access given to many sources to be able to use as needed.
Sure.
So we, for example, at Mayer Brown have talked a lot about helping often an overextended HR or global mobility team, or certainly a legal team who doesn't want to be completely managing who's going where, to give them the technology around where the data can be kept that shows who has gone where and where the audit trail
I was going to say, it all fits together. It's audit, it's centralised tracking monitoring. The centralised tracking monitoring helps you with your corporate governance, my terminology, not yours.
Sure.
It's almost as if we know what we're doing, Liz.
I know. I do. I believe that you can call it our terminology now. I love it. That's a corporate governance. Yeah, I think this is really something that can really help companies. Sometimes there's a feeling that whoever is responsible for whichever part of the mobility function, 'cause in a way it's an ecosystem or a supply chain, if you will, of people, doesn't want to take on more than what they already have before them. But this is a way to actually have more oversight over the function and less to do. You can turn over, you can delegate certain responsibilities to your outside counsel or other resources, your business managers, your receiving local office, but with some sense of what's happening so that you can have all the other best practices that we've talked about to protect the company, protect reputation, protect from significant loss, and sometimes protect from personal penalties, because in some cases when you're dealing with regulated industries like banks, the head of the HR function that handles mobility may actually have obligations for disclosure and other aspects that they could be personally liable for if this deviates from the mandate.
At that
it
stage.
is.
And
it really is.
Underneath all of this is the ability to sleep easier at night if organisations are doing this. Okay,
yes.
let's talk about your fifth and final point then. Around work records and right to work records. What would you be saying was the essential element for the mobility program?
Well, inevitably, more and more countries are going to be looking for validation that individuals who are with the company are actually lawfully within the country and lawfully authorized to work. In the UK, of course, the right to work check is now quite standard. It's been compulsory for many years, and companies are responsible for checking the legality of the work rights of every employee that comes in. But because it seems a very administrative check, it's amazing how porous the records can be
yes.
as to not really meeting the mandate. The consequences of not meeting the mandate are that the company can actually become a victim of intense scrutiny as to their mobility program. In the UK, again, for example, if your right to work check records are highly imperfect, what is the biggest penalty that the company is likely to face? One can talk about criminal penalties for employing illegal workers, but if we're talking about a professional services firm, a bank, a high-level multinational, it's unlikely that they're going to have a high degree of illegal workers. Maybe they've had someone slip in, but it's unlikely. What instead will happen is the biggest penalty is they will lose their sponsorship license.
Yes, of course.
Because they will lose their Class A standing. The same is true in the United States. The same is increasingly true in some of the Asia, in Australia, where validation of the work rights is interpreted to mean that the company has a reliable decision-making process and an audit trail and appropriate records. So the danger in it of not doing this right and setting up standards and controls and right to work check is that it can compromise your ability to sponsor new employees and limit your ability to staff what you need to staff.
And I imagine there's also pretty horrendous PR consequences.
Absolutely.
In this environment that we're in, if you are a company that is flouting our immigration requirements to import workers unlawfully, whatever the true circumstances, that sounds like a pretty uncomfortable PR problem to have as well.
That's right. And if you look just a little bit under the surface, suppose that it wasn't just the right to work check. Suppose the background check didn't get done as well.
Uh-huh.
One of our clients who we were recently speaking about, not their direct right to work check, but the right to work check of the vendors and their subcontractors that are used, said, if they're not doing this right, what happens if we have someone who presents any kind of terrorist threat that's filtered into our environment on site, and we haven't taken the protocol for that? Can you imagine how incendiary that would be?
I agree. So, and looking at the integrity of the right to work records, and presumably auditing that, and do you recommend a regular audit, or is it a do an audit now, get everything into shape as part of this process? What's the general approach we're seeing for clients?
We recommend a regular audit. If an audit hasn't been done, some companies have never done a full-on audit. If they've never done it, it's very important to take a relatively large sampling and consider whether you do an end-to-end audit of the current population. But then the regular audit that can follow from that can be a sampling that's done every year.
Yes.
That's enough. If there is an incident to alert the company that there's a concern outside of that, of course, on that moment you'd investigate. But otherwise, an annual audit is plenty if the company feels strongly that the people that are administering this have understood the process, have been trained properly, and understand it. We recommend an annual training refresh with that annual audit because stuff does change, and that creates ease. Any one of these 5 best practices can sound intimidating to a company if they've never done it. But once you've done it, maintaining those standards and controls becomes much easier. It's taking the first step to do each of the 5 things.
Prevention is better than a cure. It always is. And is that audit, the idea of an audit, something that's done, you'd recommend is done by a centralised function rather than a devolved function for consistency of approach?
Yes, we actually believe that as a best practice, the right to work check should have a review, if you will, a peer review real time by a central source, because a central source can't do all the inductions and onboardings across the sites of the company. But then an actual external audit done with that internal central team should be done annually.
Yes.
Of a sampling.
And then looking at that, the findings from that sampling, and saying, look at it, honestly and with an open mind. Either this is good or actually there are weaknesses here, and then acting on them. Because the worst thing is you identify weaknesses and then don't act on them.
Exactly. Yeah, no, you really do. And you get a grade. Essentially, you get a score by doing that audit. What's my percentage error and what's the nature of the errors? I'll remediate it, so I've created leniency by remediating now to the extent that I can. Timeliness, you can't remediate, but you can cure having not done the check correctly. It helps. But it really needs to be taken seriously and acted on, or the people who are administering the function will get a message that perhaps it wasn't that important as well. So you're really multiplying the problem at that point.
I can see that. So if you step back, let's just draw back from the 5 steps that we've been talking about. Do you see the companies and groups that grapple with this, that go into this process, are getting a competitive edge against companies and groups that are not doing this, or are perhaps kicking the can down the road in the hope that it's simply too difficult to handle box?
Yes, absolutely. There is no question that there will be winners and losers in this environment, and the winners are not only protecting the company, but actually being seen as more reliable companies to their customers, to their shareholders, and frankly, to their own employees, which is a very good message to send forth. It also shows fairness, equitable approach, etc. Like any good compliance program, it actually can be a basis of pride, professional pride, and distinctiveness.
Yes. sounds fairly clear-cut reason for acting in that case. Okay.
Well, I do sound like quite pro-compliance, but I think
You've come down off the soapbox.
prevent, detect, remediate is a good formula.
Yes. So, listen, I said I'd ask you a final question to wrap up. Books, music, or film? Come on, you know you've done this enough time. Which one are we going to do?
We'll do music today.
Okay. Favorite piece of music, or a piece of music you'd like to tell us about?
Well, I think I have many. I'm an eclectic listener of music, and I like so many different songs. But I'll tell you, there's a recent song that's come out in the pop world that I just really think is needed nowadays. It's "Human." Have you heard it? "Human." I'm only human, and I think that in today's world, it's there's so many gotcha moments with what the media reporting is, and people start to emulate this behavior that's thrown at them. It's nice to remember I'm only human, and I can take action to cure concerns that perhaps I've identified. But I'm only human, and I wish you'd understand. Not only I'm only human, but you're only human too. Yes. Can't we be human together? Yes. I really like it, and it's got quite a nice beat as well.
Fantastic. Well, listen, thank you very much indeed for that, Liz. And let's leave it there. But I think we've covered a lot of ground. And as always, it has been such a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Nick. I've so enjoyed London. Thank you.
Take care.
So, that concludes this podcast. We hope that you find it and others in this special Another View series helpful. If you have any comments or questions, please email Nick at nrobertson@mayorbrown.com. This podcast is an overview of the cases and law, and how the law will apply in any particular case will depend on the individual circumstances. Listeners should seek legal advice if any of the matters discussed are relevant to a specific issue or concern. Thanks for listening.